In this online tutorial, I'm modeling for my students how to intellectually and dispassionately engage with controversial art. What that means is that I am not attempting to make any sort of religious or political statement or promote any sort of agenda. So if this is an exercise that you are not open to engaging in, I probably would not watch this video. Now I'd like to start out by just looking at this work of art on its own, before providing a title which will affect our interpretation of the image. What we see is a presentation of a crucifix, which is a long-standing symbol of the Christian belief of Jesus Christ's martyrdom. Now, from an art historical standpoint, we see that there are medieval qualities. We see this in the use of gold, which is typical of Byzantine icon paintings, in addition to a similar seriousness and austerity, which is suggested in our postmodern image with the strict horizontal and vertical linearity imposed by the cross, which we can see structures the composition. What we can also see is that our postmodern image has Baroque qualities. In both cases, we see a dynamic compositional structure, a dramatic presentation of subject, and a dark, heavy emotional quality. So we can see that our postmodern image is not without a discernible art historical precedence that is consistent with a tradition that developed rather consistently throughout time. Now, what do you think of this work when you consider it formally? Again, it's really dynamic and dramatic, and to me, the way that this image is presented does well in emphasizing the fact that in the end, Christ was alone in his death, as we all are. The treatment of the diffused light, the aesthetically pleasing color creates an emotional connection between the viewer and the subject. So how is it then that this work of art, which is visually appealing in a conventional sense, and one that seems to have a clear place in the development of art over time, has a place here in this lecture that is addressing controversial art? So what this is a photograph of a small plastic crucifix that has been submerged in the artist's urine. This artwork was first exhibited at the Stuck's Gallery in New York City in 1987, and at first it was received by the public favorably, so much so that Serrano was one of 10 artists that in 1989 was selected out of 599 applicants to be awarded a $15,000 prize that was partially sponsored by the NEA. The NEA is the National Endowments of the Arts, which is a government program. Now, part of this award was to include the work in an exhibit that traveled around the country. So for about 2 years, everything was fine. But this traveling exhibit eventually brought visibility to this photograph. The first public critique was in January of 1989, and was by someone who wrote a letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who said that this image promoted, and I quote, hate and intolerance. And the author of this letter also compared Serrano to the KKK. However, the real controversy was stirred when someone named Reverend Willman, who was the founder of the National Federation for Decency, which I'm just going to stop right here for a minute. This already should be raising some red flags. The National Federation for Decency. So first of all, this foundation is operating in a religious context. But not all people in America subscribe to the same religion. So to define decency, which is a highly subjective term, through a singular religious lens, and to expect all people to subscribe to these definitions, despite their own religious or personal definitions of decency, is highly problematic. Now, what this Reverend Willman did was he sent out over 1 million letters of protest, including sending letters to every single member of the United States Congress. Once this one person decided that we should be offended and told us we should be offended, then people were offended. Now, considering the initial reaction to this piece, or lack thereof, versus what happens after Willman stirred the pot, it brings up some interesting questions regarding who gets to decide what is offensive or what warrants citizenship. After Willman's extensive protest campaign, Serrano received death threats, which, by the way, doesn't sound very Christian to me. He lost numerous funding sources, and in 2011, while on display at the Contemporary Museum in Avignon, the photograph was vandalized beyond repair by a Christian protest group. The ironic thing here is that Serrano is Catholic, and he did not make this image as a means to denigrate the religion. Quite the opposite. Instead of a knee-jerk reaction, a consideration of what Serrano was actually trying to communicate here may have prevented the senseless destruction of this artwork, which is something that should provoke concern. We have seen in art history the motivations for the destruction of artwork, which typically involves the attempt to control and dictate ideology. Serrano saw bodily fluids as the essence of life. He wanted to connect this to the luminosity seen here, to create this image of beauty. The beauty being the potential we have to establish a very intimate, highly personal connection with God. Considering the idea of the personal, it really wouldn't make sense to use something other than a bodily fluid. And Serrano makes the argument, and he has a point here, that these bodily fluids define our very humanity, the processes of our bodies, and maybe even the representation of its weakness. It's a humility that in and of itself is very beautiful. A humility, right? Humility being a Christian value. He also makes the point that for him, he's not attaching any sort of moral judgment to bodily fluids. He's not seeing them as dirty or polluted or anything like that, which is part of where the source of the controversy was coming from. He wanted to connect the urine as a representation of his humanity to the humanity of Christ, which is something that is definitely being referenced in the crucifixion. Finally, he points out that the emphasis on the body within Christianity was seen with the emphasis of the body on the body of Christ, the body and blood of Christ, which is an integral part of the Christian Eucharist. So all in all, the point was for Serrano to use this image to work through and define his personal relationship with God, while leaving the image deliberately ambiguous to encourage the viewer to do the same thing. Now, it's likely that this ambiguity in part was what made people so uncomfortable. At first, this is a visually attractive image, but then you realize it's urine. And then there's also this idea that it's a representation, yet there's this literalism, and that can be something that's sort of hard for people to intellectually navigate. Now, of course, the title isn't helpful. It's inflammatory. By calling it Piss Christ, piss being slang for urine, not that urine Christ would have been any better, probably, he could have given it a more abstract name so that it was never known that the yellow tint in this photograph was coming from urine. But Serrano wanted to be honest, and again, he saw that the fluid was absolutely essential to the meaning of the work. Now let's look at some other examples of Serrano's work. And what do you guys think of these pieces, which were part of the same series as Piss Christ? To me, they're very abstract expressionists. The one on the left reminds me of hard edge abstract expressionism. The one on the right reminds me of gestural abstract expressionism. Now what do you guys think? Interestingly enough, there hasn't been that much focus on these pieces because people are so focused on Piss Christ that really no one's paid attention to these. To be honest with you, I didn't even know that Piss Christ was part of a series and that these works existed until I started to do the research to put together this presentation. Now, all I could find in terms of reaction is that some of the people in the Jewish community were offended by milk blood. And this is a photograph of a container of blood positioned directly next to a container of milk. And they were offended because it promoted the mixing of blood and milk, which was in contradiction to kosher practices. Now, I think we can also get a sense of the controversy if we consider the context when thinking about why photographs of bodily fluids in particular would be so controversial. In the late 1980s, this was a time when Americans were coming off of a very intense cultural apprehension regarding the body, and this apprehension was caused by the AIDS epidemic. There were healthy fluids versus those which were infected, and those infected fluids could cause the spread of a fatal disease that at the time was still not well understood by the public. In addition to this context, we have Piss Christ, which is asking the viewer to reconcile their religious beliefs with underlying social issues, and that understandably would promote an unease within most people. Now, I'd like to just add in a little footnote. A shout out to one of the heroes of art history, right up there with Giotto and the Etruscans, and that would be Marcel Duchamp. Isn't Marcel Duchamp's piece great? It's so lovely in its gestural form. You've got these softly rounded, undulating contours within a biomorphic shape, articulated in a soft gold that contrasts boldly against a bold background. The idea of using bodily fluids in art was not seen for the first time with Serrano's work, specifically the idea of using ejaculatory fluid as a sort of painting medium. Once again, we see the inarguable evidence that Marcel Duchamp was completely ahead of his time. He's not only here presaging gestural abstract expressionism, but also the idea of using one's own semen. The story behind this artwork was that Duchamp was infatuated with an acquaintance's wife, and she was not having it. He was so overcome with lust for this woman and so frustrated by her rejections of his advancements that he ejaculated on black satin and then gave it to her as a gift. But no one knew he did this except for the artist himself. The medium of semen actually wasn't identified until 1987 when the FBI, for some reason the FBI, tested it in its laboratories. It's a sophisticated work if you think about it. On the surface, it's a commemoration of unrequited lust, but in a way it's also like a self-portrait, and it's like an invitation for sexy time, sexual intercourse, like a sort of naughty Valentine. This sort of conceptual complexity is typical of Duchamp's work, in addition to the sense of humor that tends to be incorporated into his work as well. What's the takeaway here? There are few artists that are more legit and influential than Marcel Duchamp. Now, it's time to take a position, an informed one, now that we understand the history and intent behind this work. It is okay to hate artwork. You guys know that there are artworks out there that I completely hate. But I defend the reason why I hate them. It's important to not just make a snap judgment and immediately dislike something without understanding it first. Now, to be honest with you, I never really had an opinion about this piece. I've always just been like, whatever. But as I researched it, I really started to like it. As an art historian, I really like how it can be situated within a clear art historical trajectory. I like that this piece is very clearly referential to that history. I think it's pleasing to look at, and I like the fact that it's urine because it makes me uncomfortable. I actually really like being uncomfortable when I look at art because I feel like this is what helps me grow intellectually. I like the message of using intimacy as a way to foster a closer relationship. And I like that this intimacy is an honest one and not some romanticized cliche.